Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today, I'm going to be discussing this book, Can't Spell Treason Without T. I bought this book at Koaz for $20. I hadn't seen anything about it online before purchasing it, but reading the back cover, it seemed similar enough to Legends and Lattes that I may want to try it, and I am mildly disappointed with the story. And I think part of this rant is going to be informed by Legends and Lattes, but also Bloody Rose and Kings of the Wild and Orconomics. And as I've said in other videos, there's this genre. I don't necessarily want to call it a genre per se, now that I think about it, but there's a style of writing in American fantasy in the last about a decade, I'd say, that I like to call capitalist fantasy. And I haven't heard anyone else call it that, but I think if I'm the only one calling it that, I'll still gladly call it capitalist fantasy. All of those stories feature a very modern American style of capitalism in their settings. And each of those stories interact with that kind of capitalism, that particular flavor of capitalism. And the heroes, the protagonists of the story, are overcoming that sort of challenge. So in Kings of the Wild, for example, it's a very touring rock band kind of emphasis on that side of capitalism. And the band, Saga, that the main characters of Kings of the Wild were a part of, when they look at the later generation, the following generation's interactions with what they did as heroism, it looks like they're being mocked, that they have wranglers that go out, capture goblins, and then the heroes, the bands like Fable, which is the focus of Bloody Rose, they go and kill monsters in arenas, desperate monsters that know they're going to die in there, and do everything they can to protect the weaker ones among them. In that rant about Bloody Rose, I mentioned the way that the capitalism comes up, but instead of focusing on the evils of that flavor of capitalism, the story focuses on a zombie necromancer end of the world plot. And in Orconomics, there is, to a degree, in the second book, that same kind of necromancer plot, but all of it is framed in the sense of how are we going to help the disadvantaged come out on top after this. Whereas in Bloody Rose, it's just survival is the focus. So there's these two very different styles of facing capitalism and the setting, and how that emphasis on money, that emphasis on wealth, that emphasis on privilege, that emphasis on human first interacts with the people of the setting. And Legends and Lattes does that kind of well, but in a very imaginative way. And I like Legends and Lattes, but as Travis Baldry put it on a tweet, and I still have to find that tweet someday, he talks about how he wanted to make a Hallmark movie as a fantasy story. And that's where cozy fantasy came out of. This style of Hallmark Christmas or Hallmark holiday movies. And that small hometown vibe is something he tried to capture in Legends and Lattes. But he also deals with all the aspects of starting a business, a lot of the pitfalls, a lot of the finding contractors, fitting your business into the vibe of the community, a lot of, trying to find clientele, trying to find new things that'll keep clientele coming. In Legends and Lattes, the coffee shop doesn't work out well right at the start. It's really a slow trickle. But then they have the bard come in, and the bard brings an audience, and they bring that back because she recognizes that the coffee shop is only going to survive if the clientele has a reason to keep coming back. And the clientele aren't going to come back just for the coffee. They're not going to come back just for the baked goods. They're going to come back because the vibe of the place is what keeps them happy. Can't Spell Treason Without T kind of tries to emulate that, but what I was thinking of, and the thought came to me about 10 minutes before this rant, was if you've ever seen the behind the scenes videos or interviews about Boys in the Hood, I want to say it's Cuba Gooding Jr. has a moment in that interview where he's just exasperatedly ranting about all these different dorky movie pitches that wanted him to star in it that are just poorly ripped off capitalist grabs at the Boys in the Hood vibe. That Boys in the Hood captured something that had soul and that had meaning, and then once that became popular enough that the director, the writer, ended up getting the youngest nomination for Best Director at the Oscars that year, and he didn't win, but he had pretty big name competition that year, to be honest. But once the people with money saw that Boys in the Hood touched the audience in a particular way, they tried to emulate that. And he's exasperatedly mentioning all these bizarre names for pitches of movies that slide across his desk or that his agent got, and he's laughing about it. And Can't Spell Treason Without T feels akin to that to me. So it's not like Can't Spell Treason Without T is copying Legends and Lattes, but it does capture that, attempt to capture the same kind of vibe that Legends and Lattes captures. And part of it is that, these are two, I don't want to say pioneers because that may come to bite me in the butt later. Maybe it turns out there were other great cozy fantasy stories that come into place. And now that I think about it, Charles DeLint probably wrote one or two of those, and there's probably a lot more from that 80s era that have that cozy fantasy vibe. So, in a weird way, Wolf Moon by Charles DeLint kind of feels like Legends and Lattes, where that werewolf is trying to settle down at a tavern, and it doesn't focus on the capitalism side of things, it doesn't focus on the money-making side of things, but it does focus on the settling down and having that wholesome life, and then it gets into the violent shenanigans at the end. Can't Spell Treason Without T does a similar thing to Legends and Lattes, which is that it focuses on a startup business, but it doesn't do it quite as well as Legends and Lattes, I think. And part of that is because it's trying to hit so many different, bullet points. Like, if you're playing cozy fantasy bingo, this one, you would get bingo really quickly. It tries to do enemies to lovers, and in this case, it's a very, soft enemies to lovers. These two people, so Can't Spell Treason Without T focuses on a border town from a northern frontier part of two different lands, and both the kingdom and this confederacy, this federation, have a claim to that town. And so both have a local representative. And those local representatives are constantly at odds with each other and trying to enforce and impose their will and their laws on all of the people of the town, regardless of the what part of the divide those citizens fall under or hope to fall under. So there's kind of an enemies to lovers thing dealing with that, where the two main characters who are already in a relationship at the start of the book, as opposed to in Legends and Lattes, where the two cover characters slowly fall in love with each other. Can't Spell Treason without T, they're already in love, and they see the interactions between the two, the heads of the village on the different sides of the divide, and they immediately go like, I ship it. And I don't think they use that particular word, but they might. And it's like, it's trying to check off boxes for cute romance. Oh, look, we're starting a business, and oh, it's so cozy, and it doesn't scratch that particular itch in the same way Legends and Lattes does, because everything just goes too well. And instead of having a smaller vibe, a smaller focus to the story, Can't Spell Treason without T wants to have this grandiose adventure, this big opposing the queen. It wants to have this vibe of a big international plot. And by the way, what we really want is to just retire, settle down, and enjoy this tea shop. Whereas Legends and Lattes doesn't try to be bigger than that community. And that's kind of why that one feels better in a weird way. But like I've indicated at other times, Legends and Lattes kind of ignores the bad sides of capitalism because it wants to focus so intently on this vibe, whereas Can't Spell Treason without T doesn't even touch upon those vibes at all. It doesn't want to deal with anything. It wants to have its cake, this big international plot, this big international adventure, but it also wants to ignore all the repercussions of that as often as it can. And Legends and Lattes doesn't try to ignore all of that because that is the focus of setting up shop. So, in a weird way, it feels like the cozy fantasy of Can't Spell Treason without T is like a window dressing in a weird way. It's kind of a lie. The characters claim they want to just focus on this small town. They just want to retire. They just want to have this tea shop. But they keep on being involved and involving themselves with all sorts of other complications on a much bigger scale. And it feels, I know, like I said, they came out both in 2022. They have this vibe of being cozy fantasy, but one feels like the copycat of another, and more importantly, feels like the mediocre copycat of another. Now, I will say I love the design of Rebecca Thorne's Tomes and Tea series. This book, Can't Spell Treason without T, is very vibrant. It has this like bluish color on the edges of the pages, and I'm not always the biggest fan of that, but it looks very professionally made, and that, I guess that might be part of why I'm not as big a fan. Legends and Lattes has a very the font is almost classically fantasy in a weird way. The art itself is pretty tame. It's not trying to be all sorts of colors, all sorts of light like you see in this one. It's not trying to indicate so much of what's going on. It doesn't have the professional publication that you would have to have this kind of binding. Now, granted, that may also be because the copy I have of Legends and Lattes is from the Cryptid Press version before it got picked up by Tor. But even then, looking at Travis Baldree, he wanted a very particular vibe, and then he also shouts out his cover artist as often as he can, because that cover artist is what made. Honestly, I'd say the cover art, cover illustration by Carson Lowmiller is what drew people to it in a way. So, like I was saying, Can't Spell Treason Without T feels like a copycat, even though it came out in the same year and probably was being written around the same time. It feels like a cash grab version of Cozy Fantasy, whereas Legends and Lattes feels like the groundbreaking hit, the one with more soul in it. Now, I can't say the same for all the rest of it, whether the Tomes in T continuations are like this, or whether Legends and Lattes continuations, Bookshops and Bone Dust, is like that. And I have some thoughts on that one, which I've read as well. But Can't Spell Treason Without T, I just don't feel the need or desire to read more of this Tomes and T series. It's good enough for an okay read through, but it's not enough that I want to ever reread it. It's not enough that I want to read more of this author. It's not enough that I want to read more of the characters and the series. And that is about as much as I can say about it. So, yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.